Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are digging into a war that didn't just redraw the map of a continent, it carved the modern American West right out of the heart of another nation. And in doing so, it lit the fuse for the American Civil War.
So how on earth did this happen? How did the United States, in less than 2 years, manage to acquire over half of Mexico's land? Well, this isn't just a story about battles. It's about a really controversial idea called manifest destiny, deep political divisions, and a victory so huge it would end up poisoning the winner. Okay, let's get into it.
And just look at that change on the map. The end result was one of the single largest land transfers in modern history, totally reshaping North America. But, this didn't just happen out of the blue. To really get how a young republic pulled this off, we have to look at the powerful and pretty dangerous ideas that were fueling its ambition. Right, so this war didn't start with a single shot. It was really the climax of decades of simmering tension. It's the story of two nations on a total collision course, with the massive, resource-rich lands of the Southwest as the prize. So, in the United States at the time, this incredibly powerful idea was taking hold, manifest destiny. It was this belief that the nation was basically chosen by God to expand from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And this wasn't just about grabbing land. It was an ideological belief that American ways, American institutions were superior and were just destined to spread.
And what's so ironic is that this whole mess started with an invitation. A newly independent and pretty unstable Mexico actually invited American settlers to come populate its northern frontier. But that welcome wore out fast. There were clashes over culture, illegal immigration, and this is a big one, slavery, which Mexico had already abolished. All that led to a rebellion. So when the U.S. annexed Texas in 1845, Mexico saw it as the ultimate betrayal.
The final flashpoint, the thing that kicked it all off, came down to a line on a map. Seriously, Texas claimed the Rio Grande as its southern border. Mexico was firm that it was the newest river, so all the land in between became this incredibly volatile no-man's land. When President James K. Polk annexed Texas, he didn't just accept the state. He accepted its most aggressive border claim, and that was a deliberate move to escalate the crisis. Polk then decided to force the issue. He sent General Zachary Taylor and his troops right into that disputed territory, all the way to the bank of the Rio Grande. As Ulysses S. Grant would write later, "We were sent to provoke a fight, but it was essential that Mexico should commence it." And on April 25, 1846, they got their fight. Mexican cavalry attacked a U.S. patrol, and Polk immediately used it, declaring that Mexico had shed American blood upon the American soil. And with that, Congress declared war.
So, war is declared, and the United States launches this incredibly ambitious and devastatingly effective multi-front invasion. It was able to leverage its superior industrial strength, a professional navy, and a well-trained officer corps from West Point, many of whom, by the way, would end up fighting each other in the Civil War. The U.S. strategy was just this brutal, three-pronged attack. So first, up in the Northeast, you've got General Zachary Taylor. His job, secure the disputed land and push into northern Mexico. At the very same time, way out west, General Stephen Kearny had to lead this huge overland march to seize New Mexico and the real prize, California. And finally, the knockout blow. General Winfield Scott would lead America's first big amphibious invasion at Veracruz, and then march 260 miles inland to capture Mexico City itself. But here's the thing. While the U.S. military was winning battle after battle, the war was tearing the country apart back home. This was not some universally popular conflict. It was a war filled with deep contradictions. A lot of people in the opposition Whig Party, including a young first-term congressman you might have heard of, Abraham Lincoln, were fiercely against the war. Lincoln even introduced these spot resolutions, demanding President Polk show him the exact spot on American soil where blood was shed. They saw the whole thing as an unconstitutional power grab by a president just hell-bent on expansion. And for abolitionists like the great Frederick Douglass, the motive was way more sinister. They saw the conflict for exactly what it was, a war of conquest designed to create a vast new empire for slavery. They were terrified that any land taken from Mexico would be carved up into new slave states, tipping the nation's fragile balance of power permanently to the south. Meanwhile, what's going on in Mexico? Well, it's just crippled by this unbelievable political instability. I mean, in the first year of the war alone, the presidency changed hands 4 times. The leadership was in total chaos. Internal factions were fighting each other almost as much as they were fighting the American invaders, which made a unified defense pretty much impossible. Understanding all these nuances, the politics, the controversies, the human side of it all, that's why we make these explainers.
If you find this way of connecting the dots of history valuable, we'd really appreciate it if you'd consider subscribing to the channel. So, with Mexico City captured in September 1847, the fighting was basically over. And there's this fascinating historical side note. The U.S. diplomat sent to negotiate peace, Nicholas Trist, was actually recalled by an impatient President Polk. But Trist just ignored the order, saying he was going to make peace for the good of both countries, and he went ahead and negotiated the treaty anyway. The war was over, but the toxic fallout from this victory was just beginning. Just let that number sink in. Over 500,000 square miles. That is the size of the Mexican cession, the massive territory Mexico was forced to hand over. To put that in perspective, that's an area larger than France and Spain combined. The Treaty of Guadalupe-Hidalgo officially made Manifest Destiny a reality. It finalized the Rio Grande border and forced Mexico to give up the territories that would become the American Southwest. And then, as a final insult, the U.S. agreed to pay Mexico just $15 million, less than half of what it had offered to buy the land for before the invasion. But thinkers like Ralph Waldo Emerson, they saw this dark side even before the victory was won. They predicted that the prize itself, all that new land, was going to become a poison to the nation. And you know what? Emerson was prophetic. The moment the U.S. swallowed that new territory, the poison started to work. The question of whether slavery would be allowed in these new lands completely shattered the nation's fragile compromises. It pushed tensions to the absolute breaking point and put the United States on a direct, unavoidable path to the Civil War, which would explode just a dozen years later. To see exactly how these events lit that fuse, watch our next explainer on the road to the Civil War, right here in our U.S. History playlist.